Anyway, this week's topic is World War II. It is a time, the 1940s, when, although we will talk later about artistic movements, there's actually surprisingly little to say about philosophical developments or literary developments even. Why? Because a large number of people were redirected toward the war effort. Wilfrid Sellars, whom we read the very first week of class, was in Oxford when the war broke out. He was studying for his PhD. He never did get his doctorate. He ended up working at the Naval Office throughout the war, and a lot of people were in that position. They got diverted from whatever else they were doing to helping with the war effort, and then in the end, often accommodations were made to allow people to go on to the career they would have had if they had the PhD, but in fact what they had instead of writing a dissertation was several years working in the war effort, being involved in other ways. So what we're going to do is look really, for this week, primarily at the history of the war. There will be relatively little on cultural aspects and so on, just because there isn't, in a sense, much to say. This was total war in a way that dwarfed even the experience of World War I. There, for the armies involved, it was, of course, a total war, but for civilian populations, even in Paris, for example, relatively close to the front lines in the First World War, there was surprisingly little disruption of ordinary life. The same was true in London. That was not the case in World War II, where the entire population of countries, even that were some distance from the main action like the United States, was affected dramatically. So, let's take a look at how World War II began. We talked about the developments of the 1930s last time, how there were a series of accommodations to Hitler's demands, partly out of a sense that the Treaty of Versailles really had been unjust, partly out of a sense that if we just accommodate this demand, this will all end, partly out of a revulsion for the possibility of war. In 1939, however, things spun out of control. At the end of 1938, remember, Chamberlain had come back from Munich saying, "We have secured peace in our time. This is the last territorial demand I will make in Europe," said Hitler, while privately he was saying something very different. Now, in March of 1939, the Germans occupied Prague. That was a complete shock to the French and to the British, or at least to Chamberlain, who found it a deep betrayal. Hungary also invaded the Slovakia part of Czechoslovakia. Slovakia declared independence. Chamberlain recognized this as a profound betrayal. The idea was supposed to be that those Sudetenland, those German-speaking areas of Czechoslovakia, would become under German control, but Germans moving into Prague, that was not part of the Sudetenland, that was Czech-speaking. There was no territorial claim that Germany could conceivably have had to Prague. And so Chamberlain realized, wait, this is no longer going back and trying to reverse the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles and the outcome of the First World War. This is something new. This is going beyond that to claim something that was in no sense German. Not German by ethnicity, not German by language, not German by historical domain or anything of that sort. This was something completely new. So he said, today I share their disappointment, that is the Czechs' disappointment, the Czechs' indignation, that those hopes have been so wantonly shattered. How could these events this week be reconciled with those assurances which I've read out to you? Is this the last attack upon a small state, or is it to be followed by another? Is this in fact a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force? So finally Chamberlain got it. Finally he said, wait a minute, this is not what I thought it was. This is something completely new. There is no reason to expect that there will not be another demand following this one. And so there was a dramatic reversal of attitudes in the Western powers. On March 21st, the Germans occupied Memel in Lithuania, which had been traditionally Russian territory, and Chamberlain said, I now have to inform the House that in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, and which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. They've given the Polish government an assurance to this effect. Question?
Did he have that authority?
He did have this, well, yes, he did. He was informing the House, since this was a foreign policy matter, he felt that he did have this, but also there was a treaty with Poland that came out at the end of the First World War when Poland was created as an independent country. So this was recognizing a treaty obligation. It was not a brand new obligation. On the other hand, it was drawing a line in the sand in a very difficult and unfortunate place. Okay? There were lots of places where it would have been easy to draw a line in the sand and go no further. Okay, but you must not move troops into the Rhineland. It was easy for the French and the British to move into the Rhineland and expel the Germans from that. But you must not move into Czechoslovakia, it would have been easy to say, no, this is something beyond which you may not go. But Poland, think about where Poland is on the map. England, France are over here. Here's Germany. Poland's way over there. Okay? It's not very easy for them to do anything. This is the Eastern Front, not the Western Front. And so now they've drawn a line in the sand, but a line that's way over there and rather difficult for them to do anything about. Now, events at this point began accelerating rapidly. April 7th, Mussolini invades Albania, which seems irrelevant to most of the other things going on, but Mussolini was saying, well, if Hitler's being a tough guy, grabbing territory, I can do that too. April 16th, Russia offers a mutual assistance pact with Britain and France. Now that's a very important development. Russia, just like Italy a while before the Ethiopian adventure, decides it would like to ally itself with the British and the French. It's reviving that old World War I assistance pact, right? And what happens? How do the British respond? How do the French respond? How would you have responded? You're realizing now for the first time, wait a minute, Germany is a serious threat. The Russians, who were your allies before, say, let's be buddies again. Yes, what's the problem, right? What do the British and French in fact do? Nothing at all. They don't respond. They don't answer. Okay? This old buddy calls you up and says, hey man, remember we worked together before? Let's do it again. Same threat, right? Same deal. And you just say nothing, right? There are messages left in the machine. You don't call them back. Or there are actual contacts. Nobody ever responds. And so it was weird. Really, there was no decision made. It's not as if the British and French said, look, Russia's too unreliable an ally, or we don't trust Stalin, or whatever. They just did nothing. They didn't respond at all. Now, April 28th, Hitler renounces a non-aggression pact with Poland. Germany had agreed never to attack Poland. He says, forget it. Again, a bad sign. May 4th, Molotov replaces Litvinov as the foreign commissar. And now that turns out to be a very important development. Litvinov was the foreign minister of Russia who had made the offer to the French and the British. When the French and the British did not take him up on it, when they did not respond, Litvinov's stock fell dramatically. He was no longer in a position of authority. Basically, he had said, let's bet this way, and when that bet didn't work out, Stalin said, you're out of here, okay, and replaced him with Molotov. Now, you might know the name Molotov, right? Famous for his cocktail, and it's not a drink, okay? But he replaces him, and now his allegiance is completely in the opposite direction. So Molotov seeks an accommodation with Germany, and in fact, moves very quickly. Within a couple of weeks, the Pact of Steel has been signed between Hitler and Mussolini, and then just shortly after that, well, 3 months after that, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Stalin. And so Hitler and Stalin have allied by August. Okay, the British and French, again, had the possibility of doing this. They did nothing, and so now there's a deal between Hitler and Stalin. The two biggest bad guys in the bloc, instead of fighting each other, are now in alliance against the British and the French. I've already said that Germany, together with Czechoslovakia, was a more powerful military unit and economic resource than Britain and France combined. Add Russia to that side, and the balance gets even heavier, right? So things are now very, very bad for the British and French. Again, it would be one thing if this was the result of a decision, but it seemed to be just the result of confusion. Nobody quite knew what to do. Nobody talked to anyone else. Yeah.
When you say that, like they obviously didn't just lose the message from Russia. So
Right.
what was the strategic consideration? They're like, Russia, we don't have to divert resources. They won't make an alliance, or do you?
I have no idea. I mean, that's part of the reason,
Kinda
actually,
lost
I
in
wanted
the
to read
historical
Churchill's
record.
account. Because Churchill was, at this point, close enough to events to have some idea. And really, his sense is they were too preoccupied with more local matters on the Western Front. This seemed far away. Everybody thought, well, yeah, we should think about that and get to it. And so nobody thought about it. I mean, it was really not some deep thing. We're going to see that again and again, actually, this week, where things you would think would be the result of deep deliberation, heavy strategic thinking, are in fact whims, or things that are discarded on whims or due to confusion, or people are just busy and they don't deal with it. It's a little bit reminiscent of the lead up to World War I, where everybody's on vacation, and so nobody talks to anybody else until really matters have gotten out of hand. Here, there was an obvious opportunity for the British and the French, and they really never even discussed it, from what we can tell in the historical record. So it's very odd to know what was going on. Here is a photograph of the Ribbentrop Pact being signed, the alliance between Russia and Germany. And now, the war actually begins on September 1st, when Germany invades Poland. There is an allegation that the Polish have somehow attacked Germany and that they're doing this in self-defense, but nobody believes it. By September 2nd, France and Britain declare war on Germany. Okay, Chamberlain has drawn the line in the sand. He realizes, look, if we don't do it now, then it's just going to be the next country. And so the war begins with that declaration. Now, September 17th, just 2 weeks later, Soviet troops move into eastern Poland. And so we actually get this pincer effect. The Germans are invading from one side, the Russians invade from the other side, and Poland is trapped in between them. By September 28th, there's a Soviet-German frontier and friendship treaty. Essentially, the Germans are attacking from the west, the Russians from the east. They meet and agree to be buddies, and they divide Poland between them. Now, in November, the Soviets invade the Baltic states and Finland and overrun them, and in effect incorporate them into, well, the Baltic states they incorporate into the Soviet Union. Finland remains its own country, but neutered essentially on the Soviet side. All of this seems very bad. This is an era that Churchill refers to as the Twilight War, where the war is taking place, but so far Britain and France actually haven't done much of anything and are scarcely involved. However, something hugely important happens with the invasion of Poland. The Poles capture the Enigma machine. Now, what is the Enigma machine? It's the German code device. They capture one of these and they bring it back. They somehow get it to England. And the British start working on the German code. Alan Turing and other people who were founders of computer science begin to analyze the German code and within a relatively short time break it. So all the way throughout the war, the British can read German codes. They can read German messages. This is a huge advantage. Now, as we'll see, it sets up some moral dilemmas. There's one point at which Churchill knows, because of coded messages, that the Germans are about to bomb Coventry. His son is in Coventry, and lots of other people, of course. Should he evacuate? Should he let people know? Should he give warning? He makes the decision not to do it, because it would allow the Germans to infer that their code had been broken. They really thought they had an unbreakable code with the Enigma machine. Here's what it looked like. Sort of an old-fashioned cash register or typewriter or something. But it was, for the time, immensely sophisticated, and it was a huge intellectual achievement to break the code and figure out how to use this to read German codes throughout the war. Now, at this point, Churchill, in the book, goes through a sort of record of the lost advantages. He says, I want you to appreciate how bad our situation was and how needless it was that it be that bad. Germany had been disarmed by treaty, right? Germany was no longer to be a serious threat to Britain or to France or to other powers of Europe. But look what's happened. They rearmed in violation of treaty. MacDonald, Baldwin, and others had allowed them to increase their army beyond the bounds, increase their navy beyond the bound of 24 ships, to develop a submarine force, to begin building an air force, which was completely against the terms of the treaty. Air superiority and then even parity was cast away as the Luftwaffe became stronger than the Royal Air Force. The Rhineland, which was supposed to be demilitarized, was forcibly occupied. France and Britain did nothing. The Siegfried Line, a defensive line, was built on the German side. That too was against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Nothing was done. The Berlin-Rome axis was established so that Hitler and Mussolini allied. That was needless. Mussolini wanted to be friends with the French and British, but was alienated rather foolishly. Austria was then annexed. Czechoslovakia, its army, and its munitions factories were seized, which really did tilt the balance of power in Hitler's favor. Then, potential US and Russian help were squandered. At the same time, Russia was offering a formal alliance. Roosevelt was offering American help of a variety of kinds, and nobody was responding to Roosevelt. And so the US wasn't really offering quite a formal alliance in the way the Russians were, but nevertheless was offering war material, war preparations, a variety of other things that were ignored. Now, Churchill reflects on all of this and says history, which we are told is mainly the record of the crimes, follies, and miseries of mankind, may be scoured and ransacked to find a parallel to this sudden and complete reversal of 5 or 6 years' policy of easygoing, placatory appeasement. and its transformation almost overnight into readiness to accept an obviously imminent war, on far worse conditions and on the greatest scale. In other words, what he was saying is basically, in 1933, the beginning of the year when Hitler took power, things were still the way they were at the end of World War I. And now in 1939, just 6 years later, the situation is dramatically different. All of the advantages that the Western powers had are gone, and in fact now the balance of power is tilted heavily against them. So, here is what he says. Still, if you will not fight for the right, when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory will be sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment when you have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. There may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there's no hope of victory, because it's better to perish than live as slaves. Now, he's partly here calling the British and everyone else to the war that they have to face. But he's also got a serious problem, a historical and philosophical puzzle, really. And I don't think he comes up with a conclusion to this, but he is raising the question. Is this inevitable for democracies? That is to say, was it the particular failing of Baldwin and MacDonald and other people in the British leadership, Lloyd George, to allow this to happen? Or is it something about democracies that causes this to happen? It's been said that democracies very rarely fight other democracies. And indeed, that seems to be true. They sometimes do, but it's very rare. People, when given the choice, choose peace rather than war. And so he says democracies are reluctant to fight wars. And that's a virtue, right? That's a good thing, that they're reluctant to fight. They rarely fight other democracies, but they're reluctant to fight even tyrants. Now he says that means that they refrain from using force. At times when it would be easy to use force to remove a potential threat, until it's absolutely clear that you have no choice and fighting is inevitable. But by that time, the odds are against them. So he's worried here. Is it a problem for democracy that democracies will postpone war until they have no choice? But by then, they're facing a difficult circumstance. Now, it's possible to answer no. This is just the way things happened to work in the 30s for a variety of contingent historical reasons. It was partly the failing of people like Baldwin and MacDonald and Lloyd George and Chamberlain. It was partly the trauma of the First World War that made people react in the way that they did, and so on. It was partly the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles. Or you can say, no, actually, there's something more general here. Democracies are, of course, reluctant to fight. While overall that's good, while there's evil in the world, it becomes highly dangerous. Yeah?
How does he support that in the face of democracies that have been extraordinarily aggressive because people have wanted the resources that are around them? Like, Athenian democracy, part of the huge reason it came to a war with, Sparta is because it expanded so much. Or you can talk about some policies of America. Like, we fought a hell of a lot of preemptive wars, some of which may not have been justified,
Okay, yeah, there are two reasons why you might think, look, this isn't inevitable at all. One reason is, you're right, democracies have sometimes chosen war and sometimes chosen preemptive war. Athens is the classical example. I don't know if you were taught any ancient history at all. But anyway, when I was taught ancient history, we were sort of taught that the Athenians were the good guys and the Spartans were the bad guys, though I always found myself intuitively on the Spartan side of things. And I felt guilty about that, especially then when I studied philosophy, because I thought, gee, I'm supposed to love Athens, not love Spartans and their military, blah, 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 blah. They were kind of the bad guys, right? But the more you look at it, the more you realize, well, actually, it was the Athenians who were, in most cases, the aggressors, and they were the democracy, not this highly militaristic culture. They were usually fighting in defense. And so it's not what you would think. And I would like to say the United States has never fought a war of aggression of any kind, but that's probably not quite right. In fact, it's certainly not quite right. And so, in fact, democracies do sometimes choose aggression. So they're not always this reluctant. Now, I don't see Churchill here making an argument. He's not telling you, look, this is essential to democracy. I think he's merely worried about this. He's saying, look, our experience with democracy, especially in its modern form as opposed to its Greek form, is relatively new. We've only got, 100, 200 years of experience with democracy in various parts of the world. Are democracies going to have a tendency to be patsies, to, in effect, get pushed around by tyrants until it's almost too late, maybe until it is too late? So I don't see him really coming to a definite conclusion. And certainly you're right, he doesn't advance much of an argument. But it does strike me as an important question. Now, there is so much singular about the aftermath of World War I and about the 1930s. You might say, look, remove that kind of background, remove the Great Depression and all of that, this wouldn't have happened this way. But at any rate, I think it's a legitimate question to say, but what if it would? Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's right. I mean, democracies are reluctant to fight, especially if they're facing a formidable, like, opponent. I mean, because, like, the U.S. has had wars of aggression, but, like, like the Spanish-American War or something like that, it was just like, oh, this is kind of easy, let's go fight this war. But I mean, generally,
Right.
I think with most democracies, they don't want to go into a war that's costly, and, like, this is just, like, an example of that. Like, Britain and France are going to wait till the last minute until they have to fight.
Right.
People, when they have the choice, yeah, like you said, they don't want to get millions of people killed.
Okay, good. Democracies are reluctant to get people killed, and if we look at the lost advantages, and think about when it was easy, right? At this point, it gets hard. The shift of Czechoslovakia makes it much, much harder. But of course, Czechoslovakia was on the other side of Germany too. Geographically, that would have been hard to defend. The annexation of Austria, that would have been difficult to defend. After all, it's again an awkward geographical position. The Rhineland, but when did that happen? That was pretty early, right? And so people would have had to see the writing on the wall by, say, 1934 or at the latest 1935 for it to really be easy. And so after that, it gets tough. So you're right. I mean, one way of looking at this is to say, democracies are pretty unwilling to fight wars they don't think they can easily win. And after, say, 1935, early in that year, let's say, it wasn't going to be that easy to win. Now, before that, it would have been. It was certainly right that if Britain and France had responded to the Rhineland invasion, Germany was still very weak. They could have just gotten rid of the Nazis. One thing they did not know at the time is that the German generals were at all of these points very unhappy with Hitler and would have been happy to stage a coup. So actually, it would have taken relatively little to get Hitler overthrown. But they didn't realize what was happening internally in Germany. But you're right, after, say, 1935, it wasn't going to be very easy to resist these steps. They would probably still win. They still had the balance of power in their favor. But it wasn't going to be trivial.
Right. And up to 1935, I guess, like, people didn't understand the gravity of the situation at all. Because, like, we have hindsight to
Right.
be like, oh, Hitler is like a crazy, demon. Like,
Right.
Let's watch out. But back then, people didn't know, and we didn't have the communication either
Right.
to care.
No, exactly. And they really were in a position to say, well, we really knew the Rhineland was yours, old boy, so of course you can have it, right? You can move your troops in, but it is a part of Germany. And the same thing with every other step, right? I mean, in hindsight, you're absolutely right. We can see each of these as a stage in a process that was going to go far beyond the bounds of anything Hitler had any plausible claim to historically. But it wasn't that obvious by 1935 that that was going to be the case. Okay, so in any case, it seems to me an important sort of question to think about, not a question that I think has a very clear answer. But Churchill does say, yes, if circumstances are such as to warrant it, force may be used. It should be used under the conditions that are most favorable. There's no merit in putting off a war for a year if when it comes. It's a far worse war, one much harder to win. Surely true. On the other hand, how do you know when the circumstances warrant it, right? So again, it's very easy to say this in hindsight, maybe much more difficult at the time to recognize when the circumstances are such that a war has now become inevitable. And so you better just decide when you're going to fight it. Now, in any case, to go back to the Twilight War, in September, already by the end of the month, the Germans and the USSR had divided Poland between them. And in October, already, the Nazis began a policy of extermination, initially of the sick and disabled. November 30th, the USSR attacks Finland, but a series of events begin to take place in 1940 that accelerate the war, and accelerate in particular the involvement of Britain and France. By January, there's rationing in the UK. It's often forgotten today, but even in the United States, there was extensive rationing all throughout the Second World War. Rationing of gasoline, rationing of sugar, of butter, of milk, of all sorts of consumer products. Metals were very difficult to come by and so on. In one sense, the war brought full employment and ended the Great Depression. From another point of view, people probably lived worse than they did in the 1930s, in many cases because of rationing. It was very difficult to get enough sugar, flour, other basic goods to feed a family. And during this time, there were all sorts of recipes that people developed for cooking in hard times. Apple pie without apples and things like that. You took the things you could get And you found that Ritz crackers, for example, if baked in a pie, taste like apples. I've actually had that. My grandmother had a recipe for appleless apple pie. And in short, for the average person in the UK, starting at the beginning of 1940, and in the United States by the beginning of 1942, life gets hard, and everything is going to the war effort. March 16th, the Nazis bomb Scapa Flow, which is the main naval base for the British Navy in Scotland. The Nazis invade Norway and Denmark on April 9th. Denmark surrendered 2 days later. It wasn't much of a resistance. The Nazis invaded. By the way, I had heard great stories of this when I was in school. We'll get to those in a moment. It turns out, according to my friends in Denmark, these are not true. They're made up. But anyway, that's very sad. I thought the Danes were these heroic people. Maybe. I will still say to the camera, yes, the Danes were heroic people, but maybe it's not exemplified here very clearly. The Nazis invade the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France in May, and so by now the war is in full swing. So you can see what's happening here. This is Europe and Asia Minor in 1924. Germany and the Soviet Union have taken Poland and divided it. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are now part of Russia. Finland has been neutralized. Czechoslovakia has been divided up, Hungary taking this half and Germany taking that half. Austria has been annexed. The Rhineland has been militarized. There's an invasion of the Low Countries here, an invasion of France, an invasion of Norway. Denmark has been taken. Italy has taken Albania. You've now got a huge area of Central Europe that has been taken over and is under Axis control. And of course, at this point, the USSR is in alliance with Hitler. Things are very bad. On May 10th, Churchill becomes prime minister. I have nothing to offer, he says, but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And he, as he says right at the end of the book, I have no dreams, but facts are better than dreams. So, there he is. And his steely jaw of determination, which helps to get the British through the war. Now, the attack on France accelerates. The Netherlands surrenders by the middle of May. Belgium surrenders by the end of the month. June 4th, Dunkirk. The British army is trapped in one small coastal town. They had been trying to maneuver, trying to defend Paris. Hitler, very cleverly, by moving through the Low Countries and securing them, is able to maneuver the British army onto a small peninsula. He really has the opportunity at this point to destroy conclusively the British army. He does not do it. He lets them escape. 338,000 soldiers are evacuated from Dunkirk. Churchill puts out the call, basically says every vessel that can possibly float should go to Dunkirk and help bring back soldiers. And virtually every boat in England goes. Not only the Royal Navy, but anyone with a fishing boat, anyone with a sailboat. A huge flotilla of civilian craft go to Dunkirk and bring soldiers back. It is a dramatic scene. Hitler had the ability and had the Air Force at that point. He wouldn't have even had to attack, really, with ground troops. He could have simply, straight from the air, he could have bombed. He doesn't do it. Why doesn't he do it?
He kind of views the British as like kinship almost, doesn't he? Like he
Yes.
has this weird respect for them and kind of like, I don't know, he allies himself with them weirdly. Like I
Good.
just remember hearing that.
Exactly. Who are the English? In fact, the English language is what kind of language?
Germanic.
It's a Germanic language, right? It was spoken by the Angles and the Saxons who invaded and took over and colonized England. He sees the British as ethnically and racially close kin, okay? And so he is convinced that not only do they have a proper role to play in his sort of racial hierarchy, but moreover that surely they will agree with him. And so he's convinced that he can get Britain on his side. That if he just maneuvers Britain into this position, but then shows them generosity, he will be able to neutralize Britain and he will get at least a non-aggression pact with Britain. He hopes eventually an alliance. Now, with Churchill at the helm, that's a crazy hope. But he did not properly assess the character of Churchill. His thought was, look, we have so much in common. Our languages are closely related. Ethnically, we're closely related. Our cultures are really quite closely related. Surely we can come to some kind of agreement.
And really, like, he didn't like the Russians. That was like,
That's right, he hates the Russians, right? But he's basically friendly toward the British, so he's allied with the people he really hates, and he's now finding himself the enemy of the people he wants to have as allies, and he thinks are natural allies. And so he lets the British army get away, partly because he thinks eventually they'll be my ally, partly he thinks that act itself will show the British that he's not as bad as they think he is. Now, June 10th, Norway surrenders. The Germans enter Paris already by June 14th. So, unlike World War I, where France holds out and there's really a stalemate that lasts for years, in this case, France collapses within weeks. Okay? And France surrenders on June 22nd. Here is a line of British soldiers on the beach at Dunkirk, awaiting their turn to get on the boats. And now, yes, the Battle of Britain begins in the summer of 1940. Hitler is now in control of not only Central Europe, but in control of the Low Countries in France. He doesn't want to have to invade Britain. He hopes that the British will surrender and form a non-aggression pact with him. Something in the way that the Swedes did. The Swedes were never invaded. They preemptively said, listen, you don't have to attack us. We'll give you whatever you want. We'll be buddies. We'll be trading partners. And so he was hoping the British would come to some sort of Swedish accommodation. Now, what does he do? Well, he does this aerially. He begins to bomb Britain. He bombs airfields and factories. And initially the thought is this. We'll bomb the air. The Royal Air Force is powerful. It's going to be very hard to defeat them in the air. But if you destroy the airfields, there will be no way for them to take off and land. And so for about 2 weeks, the Germans, in addition to bombing military factories, bomb airfields throughout Britain. It's a brilliant strategy. But after 2 weeks, does it get the Royal Air Force grounded? Well, no. There are still some airfields they can go to, and so British planes are still in the air. And Hitler begins now a series of what I can only call military mistakes. Throughout the 30s, while he's been sort of playing on this chessboard of European politics, he's been succeeding at every turn and amazing his generals. But now he starts making a lot of foolish decisions. So, for 2 weeks, it doesn't get the job done. The Air Force is still flying. He says, all right, forget it, we'll move to a new strategy. Churchill tells us, if they had done it for 1 more week, the Royal Air Force would have been grounded. The planes would have been there, but they would have had nowhere to land, nowhere to take off. This strategy, in other words, almost worked. But Hitler wouldn't stay with it long enough to make it work. So he changes his mind and begins bombing cities. By August 15th, daylight bombing of cities. August 23rd, the bombing of London. On August 25th, the British bombed Berlin in retaliation, but not nearly as effectively as the bombing campaign against London. Here you see Big Ben in the background, behind barbed wire. Here is a sort of typical scene, London in 1940 at a railway station. You see children being packed off to go to the countryside to get out of the cities, to keep them safe, while soldiers are headed into the cities to try to prepare civil defense to protect them. Have any of you ever read C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia trilogy? Right? It begins this way with the kids fleeing London. And this really was a commonplace thing. Here is the air defense network. There was radar on the coast, but what was defending London? People like this, standing on rooftops with binoculars, looking for planes, and being ready to put out the alert. You can see how vulnerable England was. All of these lines are from German air bases established in northern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and then Germany, and even Denmark and Norway, to places in England that were within range of bombers. And so you can see the number of different places they could be coming from. Really, about 24 airfields were capable of hitting Britain. And so you never knew which direction planes were going to be coming from, when they might arrive. If you've got an array of fighters you can send in the air, where do you send them? They could be coming from any direction toward any part of the British Isles. And so the defense problem here was really very serious. And the Royal Air Force, in that respect, even though it was still able to fly, take off and land, was not able to be very effective at stopping the bombing campaign. It did its best and certainly imposed a cost on Germany, but you can see the difficulty of the task they have. Yeah.
It seems like you have to fight them once they're already over a city.
That's right. You pretty much have to respond once they're over a city. Until then, there's really no way of telling where they're headed or what was happening. The radar systems helped somewhat, but not completely. In fact, here are some scenes of the aftermath of bombing in London. You can see the London Bridge there with the smoke in the background. Here, a bus that is bombed out and a building behind it on fire. Here, crews putting out the last of a fire that had destroyed several city blocks. Here is life the next morning after a bomb attack. People on their way to work with the whole street basically bombed out. Here you see children sitting in front of what had been their home. Here you see children put into a ditch during one of the aerial attacks. A spotter on a rooftop had seen German planes coming, and so the kids would get into defensive ditches like this that those civil defense volunteers and army troops would construct. And here they are looking up for the planes. You can see their reactions on their faces, right? Some of them completely baffled, some worried, some of the kids clearly thinking, this is cool, this is cool. In any case, yeah, and here's more smoke after the bombing. There's the cathedral in the background. Now notice all of this brought things home to civilians in a way that had not taken place at all in the First World War. In fact, it was a remarkable thing during the First World War that you could be in the trenches, and within a few hours you could be in London having dinner that night. And indeed, officers would do that. They would go back, and they said one of the things that was psychologically jarring is, here you are in the trenches, here you are at the theater with your wife after a nice dinner, thinking, how can a war be taking place just a short way away? There was no way to get away from World War II. London, people in other British cities were very much in the thick of the action. Now, what was the overall strategy? What were Germany and Japan thinking? Not only at this stage of the war, but later when the United States gets involved. What was the plan? There were two fairly obvious plans that they might have had. There was a northern strategy, which was really directed at Russia. There was a southern strategy directed at the Middle East, at the Far East, and at India. And if they had chosen the same strategy, it's actually rather hard to see how they could have been defeated. But they didn't choose the same strategy. Germany chose the northern strategy, Japan the southern strategy. Now let me show you what I mean. Suppose both had decided on the northern strategy. You would have had Germany, by now basically having Central Europe under its command. Even if the British did not submit, really Britain was not in a very good position to do anything about the German takeover of Europe. If Japan had attacked Russia from the east at the same time Germany attacked from the west, Russia would have been in much worse shape than it in fact was, and indeed the war, as we'll see, against Germany was very difficult for the Russians to win. Maybe more appealing, especially given that Japan's main interest was really with the south and the natural resources that were in Southeast Asia, was to move this way. Japan already was moving this way and would move much more dramatically over the next year towards Southeast Asia and toward the southern Pacific. The Arab countries were uniformly actually on the German side. Hitler would not have had to attack them. They would have allied in a sort of Swedish fashion. He could have gone through these countries and mounted an attack on India. And essentially the plan would have been to meet Japan in India, try to force the British to fight in the most distant place and most difficult place for them to fight, and in a place where there were a lot of natural resources to be gained by doing this. Oil supplies and so on. And if you do this, then you've got Russia completely surrounded. But astoundingly, Japan moved in this direction, while Hitler ended up making the choice to attack the Soviet Union.
Was that through like lack of communication, or just them being?
There was almost, yeah, it was lack of communication. There was almost no.
To talk, yeah.
Yeah, they had a pact, but there was really no discussion, no communication at all, which is remarkable. Yeah.
When did Germany turn on Russia?
We're about to see. So that's just about to take place. But yes, really Hitler's plan was to attack Russia all the way along. Russia was the main enemy he was concerned with. And so it's all about setting himself up for the attack on Russia from his point of view. But that's always a bad mistake. Okay? Who has attacked Russia and won? Napoleon tried it.
Napoleon kind of
Devastation, right? And Hitler tries it. It's a very difficult thing to do. Yeah.
Sorry, I keep like asking questions.
No, it's good.
But like, what was that? The Germans had a plan like to dominate Europe. That was written in like the 1890s. What was that? Because that like wasn't that kind of relevant to the war for a while?
Okay, good. There were a series of plans both to defend Germany and to take over the rest of Europe that were developed exactly in the late 19th century under Bismarck. There was actually quite a brilliant plan that was then mostly discarded in World War I. To some extent, Hitler is going back to that original plan. And so you're right. Part of the reason that some of the older military guys in Germany liked Hitler is that they thought that the German vision of greatness that Bismarck had developed was foolishly cast aside in World War I, and Hitler was going back to some elements of it. So you're right, there was a long-standing plan. Now, in Mein Kampf, he lays out his own version, And so I don't know how relevant the proto version of the 19th century was, but you're right, in many ways he's going back to that earlier vision and saying that's what we ought to be doing. And that's partly a plan for defense, but partly a plan for offense. You're absolutely right. So he is building on a certain military tradition in doing this. He's not just thinking this all up on his own. Yeah.
You keep talking about the strategical thinking, and I
Yeah.
can't help but wonder, like, wouldn't strategical thinking of that sort, which acknowledges weaknesses and strengths in such a lucid way, kind of preclude the arrogance which goes into such an extraordinary war of aggression to begin with?
It would. You're right. Because if you were really thinking strategically, you would not do something like attack Russia in the middle of June, which is what he ends up doing. To take one small example. But you're right. I mean, you would realize, wait a minute, the northern strategy, right? What is in between Japan and Germany? A huge country, right? A massive country, and very unpleasant terrain. Look at this, mountains, then more mountains, then Siberia, and the steppes of Siberia that give you almost, give you very unpleasant conditions, give you almost no grain or anything else to live off. The supply line problems that are going to face you are going to be massive, really in both directions. And moreover, although Japan by this point has a powerful army and one that's getting much more powerful, that kind of large-scale land operation is not what the Japanese excel at. They excel at a sort of combination of army-navy maneuvers, and so it wasn't really the kind of fighting the Japanese were prepared for. The tactical problems, the strategic problems involved in doing this would be overwhelming. If you were doing careful thinking, you'd probably choose not to do it. That's why if I had been a German general, I would have been insisting on the southern strategy. It would seem to me the only one that had any hope of working. But that's not to say it's not also massively difficult and something forget the moral question that you shouldn't do it. Just the strategic problems were serious. But at least I can see how that would have a probability of success. It's hard to see how the others had even much of a probability of success. Yeah.
Just to clarify, I thought there really wasn't a strategic strategy to attack Russia. He did not care about the strategy of attacking Russia. He just hated Russia. It wasn't really a strategy part. It was mostly he did not like Russia. He needed them for a little bit, and then he was just arrogant enough to think that, okay, we're strong enough now, we can attack them, and so he just attacked them. He didn't really care about any southern or northern. He just did not like Russia.
Okay, good. A lot of his decisions are based on this weird racial/ethnic idea that has nothing to do with strategy, and you're right, in many ways works directly against any sensible military strategy. Yes?
Wasn't also some of that dynamic created by the disparity between fascism and communism, that those two ideologies really didn't work together, and so
yes,
Stalin and Hitler are sort of ideologically opposed to each other?
Right, so there's this deep ideological division. I mean, how deep it is questionable, but nevertheless he sees it as deep. He thinks the communists are somehow completely contrary to his vision and one of the main enemies to be addressed. So he does some things. Paul Johnson in his book reflects on theories of history here, and he says, the historical determinist says history's the play of social forces. People are doing what they've doing because of these large things. Individual people have little or no free choice and don't matter. The great man theory says, no, history is largely the record of decisions of people in great positions of power. It was called the great man theory in somewhat sexist fashion, but nevertheless, the idea was that individual people make big decisions. And in this case, Hitler and Stalin certainly seem to be making big decisions. There's no historical determinism to what they do. Hitler decides to attack Russia. You're absolutely right. And was he forced to by some... No, he wasn't forced to. There was no real condition requiring this. It was really the decision of a single person. So, in June of 1941, now basically the war in 1940 involves consolidating his position throughout Europe, but by late June of 1941, the Germans invade the USSR. Now, if you're going to attack Russia, when would you do it?
The spring.
Dead of winter.
Yes, winter is your gravest enemy, okay?
Yeah.
And so, do you wait until the end of June? No. Okay, but there was bad weather this year, and this and that thing going on, and Mussolini messed up plans and so on. And so they kept delaying it. An attack that was supposed to take place in April took place, in fact, nearly at the end of June. That gave the Germans very little time. So here you see actually a German throwing a grenade at Russian positions. And Hitler had two goals in attacking Russia. One was military conquest. That was the military strategic goal. But the other was social engineering. This was the racial and ethnic goal. Okay?
I thought he was going after the Caucasus oil fields.
Well, there were, these were not the only goals. You're absolutely right. I mean, there was the grain of the Ukraine, okay? There was the oil fields. There were specific resources he had an interest in. But the one I want to stress at the moment is this second one. That ends up shaping his decisions in ways not only that make no military sense, but that ensure the defeat of the entire enterprise. The Russians hated Stalin, especially the Ukrainians, the Byelorussians, the people in these regions who had been starved in the late 20s and early 30s. They hated Stalin. If Hitler had come in and said, "I am your liberator, join with me and march on Moscow," they surely would have done it. But instead, he sends in this group, the Einsatzgruppen, that shot 1 million Russians in 1941. Now, half of them were Jews. Half of this was part of his idea that it's not only the communists, but the Jews who were great enemies. But part of it was because they were Russians, because they were Slavs. Okay, I am, in fact, from Hitler's point of view, an abomination. I'm half German and half Slavic. Oh, what a combination from his point of view. German? Ah, that's good. But Slavic, that's horrible from his point of view. And so the Russians, anyway, very quickly in the attack realized, hold on a second, we hate Stalin, but this guy is trying to exterminate us. They see it as a war of extermination. Stalin gives the command that the Russians are to resist on pain of death. Basically, give no quarter, take no quarter, fight with your life. And most don't require much convincing. They're convinced, yes, that's what's required. Already in June, just a few days after the attack, the SS begins mass murders in this territory. By July 3rd, Stalin orders a scorched earth policy, sees it as not only a deep betrayal, given the pact, but also realizes they're out to exterminate my people. And so he orders that everything be destroyed, that people retreat as rapidly as they can, and that they destroy everything in their path. Leave no resource, leave no grain, leave nothing that the German army can take to supply itself. He shot many army officers to prevent a coup. After all, you can imagine the hostility towards Stalin in Russia. You allied us with this guy who's betrayed us? What's the matter with you? Stalin looked like a fool. So he executed a lot of people to prevent a coup. He sent former POWs to the camps and imprisoned the family of POWs. Why? Essentially to say, you fight to the death. Don't be taken prisoner, or else I will not only punish you, but punish your family. There's a wonderful song by Al Stewart about this, where at the end the guy is sent to the prison camp. Why? Because he was taken by the Germans for a day and then released. It was enough to get him spending the rest of his life in a camp. The soldiers had no choice but to fight to the death. He also transported entire nations, including the Chechens, which is responsible for some problems now. Well, anyway, here you see people about to be executed in this effort by the SS. Here you see the bodies down here. People were simply, large holes were dug, people were lined up, shot in the back of the head and thrown into the pits. Often still alive, but then they were buried, wounded and alive. Here is someone, a Russian, simply lined up and shot because he was Russian. Well, at this point, we're out of time, but it's really at this point that Hitler gives the command for the final solution. Next time, we will pick up the story here. We will look at the attack on Pearl Harbor and the involvement of the United States.